Welcome to Alpha Anywhere Demo and Q&A. My name is Sarah Mitchell, Head of Documentation, and I'm joined by Scott Allen, who is our, Scott, what do you want me to call you? I should have asked you before I started.
Classic.
If you can't tell, Dave isn't here this week.
Senior designer,
Senior
something like
designer?
that effect. Yeah,
Yeah.
something to that effect.
Okay. All right. All right. Anyway, yes, welcome everyone. Scott and I are here to do a presentation, a demo, and answer any questions you have. So if you would type those in the GoToWebinar questions pane, we will try our best to answer the questions that we think we can answer during today's webinar. Alrighty, so just a quick check here, Scott. I assume you can see my screen.
I can.
And it should look like a PowerPoint.
Yeah, we got our Alpha Anywhere logo and demo and Q&A.
All right, and you can see my mouse now.
I can.
All right, I'm just making sure because it's it's on two screens. All righty. So welcome everyone. Just before we begin, a reminder that DevCon is coming up. It's coming up fast. We have been in-house picking the things we're going to talk about this year, and we've got some really cool stuff that we want to talk about and present. And we hope you can join us. If you have not registered already, you could go to www.alphasoftware.com/devcon2021 and sign up. I think tickets are still on sale for $3.99, but that price will be going up the closer we get to DevCon. So do secure your ticket now if you haven't done so already. So a while ago, we said we were going back to basics, and today we are going to talk about the UX component, and it's an introduction to the UX component. So this is probably going to be repeat information for a lot of you who have been to these webinars before and who have been using Alpha Anywhere for a while. But my hope is that for those of you who are new, may have forgotten some stuff or are experts at grid and not UX, I hope that you learned something from here. And do, as we go through this presentation, ask your questions, and we will address those when we get to the end. So a while back, we talked about what an Alpha Anywhere app is, and an Alpha Anywhere application is built with components, and we have 5 core components in Alpha Anywhere: the UX, the grid, the tabbed UI, the login component, and the app launcher, that last one being one that isn't used very frequently, but is a core component that you can use to build your apps. And today we're going to talk about that first one on the list, the UX. And the UX component in Alpha Anywhere is a type of component for building really any type of app that you can think of. You can use it to build a web app, you can use it to build a mobile app, and you can use it in your desktop applications if you are a desktop app developer. Just a quick note there that desktop apps aren't in Community Edition, and that's because they're built using our XDialog framework, and that's just not something that is available in Community Edition. But everything here that we're going to talk about today, you can use this UX component basically in any type of app. And a UX component can be built to create a form for collecting data. So think about your traditional HTML web form where someone puts in their first name and their last name and maybe adds a comment and clicks submit, and now they've added a comment to your blog. That's a basic form, and it's what we mean when we say form here. But the UX component can be so much more than that. You can use it to create a dashboard. You can use it to build a portal where people log in and can experience a variety of services that you offer. You can use it to build an e-commerce app. You can build it to use a customer management system, a CRM. And there's really no limit to what you can do with a UX component. You can connect to as many data sources as you want. You can implement an entire video game in it if you really wanted to, though just as a side note, Alpha Anywhere is not targeted for game development. Oop, typo. So just talking about creating a UX in Alpha Anywhere. That when you create your first UX, there's 2 options you can start with. You can start with a template, which we have a lot of different templates you can choose from, and that is a great option to get started quickly. If you have an app in mind and we have a template that has that layout already, or maybe you want to build a security framework component to add into your app for managing users or something like that, we have a bunch of templates you can use to get started. But you can also start with a blank component, which is what you'll often see in these webinars. We usually start with a blank component to kind of keep the focus on the thing we want to talk about. So this is a picture of the UX builder. It's what you're going to see after you create your UX. And just wanted to point out just what the layout is and the terminology we use here. So over here on the side, this is where all the panes for the UX control are located. So you have your overview pane, which is a little introduction to the UX, and it has a bunch of information on there about what you can do with it and some links to some getting started info. And then they've got these 3 sections here called UX, events, and code. And in there is where you're going to find access to a bunch of different panes for setting properties, configuring style sheets, adding custom code, and so on. And then at the bottom here, this is going to change depending on the pane you're on, what's down in here. And because controls is selected here, you're going to see add control and all the different control sections you can select from. So just a quick overview of what we talked about. You have your overview, you have your UX, where you control the properties. Also data binding, which is only applicable to web applications. You don't want to use data binding in a mobile app. Your events, where all of the events for the UX component are located. And then a code section where you add all your custom server-side, client-side, and JavaScript actions. So the UX controls pane is where you're going to spend most of your time in the UX component. It's where you build your user interface. There's over 100 controls in there to choose from. I just noticed we've added a few more recently. And then those controls are broken down into different types of controls. And these terms are specific to Alpha Anywhere. You're not going to really see these commonly out in other tool sets, but the way we've divided them up is we have data controls, panels, containers, a category called other controls, and defined controls. So let's talk about controls here for a bit, those different categories. In Alpha Anywhere, when we say data control, we mean a control that's used to display or collect info. It can do both. And it also has a client-side API for interacting with that control. So we have a JavaScript library. The UX component has a bunch of methods in it that you can use to read a value from a control or write a value to a control. And data controls are those controls that interact with those functions. Some commonly used data controls that you're going to see often is a text box, a drop-down box, a list control. A view box is a type of data control. A map. These things can have a value that you can manipulate using the client-side API. And we'll discuss more about why I've highlighted that here. But the other two other types of controls we have are panels. Panels, you need to think of these as being screens. They're responsive. They're used to organize your controls into different views. They can react to your screen size, your orientation change. They are the best choice for building layouts for mobile applications. They also have a client-side API for manipulating what control or what panel is being shown, and also dynamically creating panels. And there's only 3 major types of panels right now. We have a panel layout and a panel navigator, which are for configuring the layout of panel cards, and all these things can be nested within each other. Another way to organize controls is using containers. And containers can be used within panels, or if you're building a web app, you can just use them to organize your app on the screen. And these are going to include things like frames, tab and encoding controls, and then we have a whole bunch of specialized container types, such as the window, which is where you could create a window container, put some controls in it, and then display that as a pop-up window. We also have a thing called an injectable container, which you put a bunch of controls in, and then those controls can be inserted into your UI somewhere using Action Javascript. We also have some things called like alignment containers for aligning controls, and a few others for configuring how controls are displayed and oriented. And we'll take a look at that later when we're in the live demo. So that's containers. Containers contain controls. We have some other controls that can also be used to display and collect information, but they don't have the get set value API. So we have data controls like text boxes, and then you have other controls like a static text object that just displays some text, or a button, or the PDF viewer. These are controls that can be used to enhance your UI and perform additional data collection, but don't have that get and set value API that you have with the data controls. And then finally, we have a category called define controls, and these tend to be complex controls with a predefined function. And what I mean by complex is like you might insert the save reset button, and that's actually just 2 button controls that have some JavaScript on the back end of the click event that when clicked, save the data in your controls up to the server, or send it up to the server where it can then be saved in your component. Reset would revert all the changes in your data controls back to what they used to be. And maybe a few others like a record navigator for a list, or the SQL trace log, which we did a demo on quite a few weeks ago. That's a special defined control that has all the mechanics built into it to query the server for your SQL trace log for your list and display it. We also have one for 2-factor authentication. There's a whole bunch in there. If you get into mobile app development and start using the form view, you can find a whole bunch of editor sets which are designed for editing values in a form view in there with custom keyboards and so on. So defined controls are a little more complex. And just as a side note, many of them are designed to interact with an existing control. So like the list record navigator requires a list to add it, otherwise it's not going to do anything. We also have a date selector, which needs 2 existing start and end date value controls, which are created using text boxes. You need to have those in your app to hook that up to provide the date selection. So that's what we talk about there. All of these controls, the UX itself, they can be extended through the use of events. And there are 2 types of events in a UX component. There are server-side events that are triggered up on the application server. They run on the server. They're implemented using XBasic. And then there's client-side events, which happen on the client, which is either the web browser or the mobile device where your app is running. And these are implemented using JavaScript. So a little bit more about server-side events when they happen. There's really 2 major scenarios where they happen. They happen when your app is loaded, when the user when a request is received by the server to download your app and display it in a web browser. And they are also triggered when an AJAX callback occurs. And an AJAX callback is really any kind of request sent to your application server to either upload information or download information. It can also be used to trigger a workflow. Maybe you've got a routine that runs on a database somewhere, and you use a callback to trigger that. That's sending information to say start this process. And all of these server-side events can be created or customized with XBasic, but we also have something called action scripting, which is available in some events. And these are pre-built XBasic actions that do things like save data to a table or send an email. Similar on the client side, these events are triggered when the user does something like clicks a button or selects a list row, or swipes across the screen to swipe to a new panel or swipe a list up or whatever. Most of them are triggered through user interaction. There are a few that are triggered as part of a workflow, like when your app is launched or loaded, when somebody does a login, or is part of the AJAX callback process. There are several client-side events that you can hook to do things like check to make sure that the user is allowed to even make a callback before you send it. And again, these are customized with JavaScript as well as Action Javascript. And just a little bit more on client-side events, there's going to be 2 places you find these. The server-side events are predominantly just located in the events section in the UX builder. But the client-side events you're going to find in 2 places. You're going to find the ones for the UX located in the events client-side pane, And then the ones for controls are usually located in the controls properties. And in both of these cases, you can build them using JavaScript. Some control events can be built with Action JavaScript, and all of them can have access to JavaScript Actions, which we discussed a while ago as well. So what I'd like to do now is the live demo. And I know I went through some of that stuff a little bit quick. So just sort of recap here about what we're looking at. This is the web products control panel. This is a new blank project I made for this webinar. And I'm going to make that bigger. So up here, if we select either all files, or you can pick web components, but I'll go with all files, and then you click new, you get this new file dialog. From here, you can pick web component, and then UX. And this gives you the select UX component template dialog. So here is where you make your first decision when you're making a new UX. Do you want to start with a template, which we have a whole bunch here, or do you want to just create a blank one? It's definitely worth a while to come in here and look at some of these, because some of them show how you do stuff. Like we have this mobile app host UX. It actually has 2 child components that go with it, and it shows how to build a parent-child relation with multiple UX components, as opposed to putting everything in one component. We have a few in here for Cordova apps, how to use the biometric user authentication, sound effects. There's an example in here about how to style your app for iPhone X. We have a few on using the pusher service. And we have a whole bunch around the security framework. And I believe the new UX components we added recently, which you can generate automatically when you add a login component, or when you when you create your new project, you can add security as you create it. But those components are in here too, and they include everything you need to provide a login interface that supports two-factor authentication. And it's definitely worth a look. You know, if you want to know how to use the extended user information table, we've got a component that shows how to do that. So it's worth exploring in here if you're looking for some examples on how to do some things, shopping app and that. So I'm going to start with a blank component today, just to keep things simple, and show you this UI. So the first time you create a UX, you might be shown this pane, and this is the overview. It shows, it explains how to get started. It's got some links here to some more information about how to use the UX, and also how to build disconnected mobile applications. The controls pane is where you can spend most of your time building your app. 2 others I didn't mention in the presentation, but are important to know about, are properties. Properties is where you can come and change your style. If you don't want to use the default alpha theme, maybe you want to use coffee. Enable or disable compact theme. If you're building a web app that's only going to be used by people with a desktop interface, mouse, keyboard, you may want to consider using the compact theme, which will reduce the space used by controls into a more traditional mouse and keyboard interface. Things are smaller. You're not gonna. It's not friendly for using your hand, but it's definitely friendly for using a mouse, which is very precise. Other things you're going to find in here are places to customize your notice messages, like, are you sure you want to save those kind of messages that we have? Like, are you sure you want to delete this record? You're going to find some of those customizations in here. You can enable your integrated login functionality here, add custom CSS or SVG icons, add custom JavaScript libraries if you have some that you want to integrate. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff down here, how you use local storage or file system. If you're building a mobile app, this will become important because here's where you can specify the files unique to your app on the file system where your data is stored. And then some other advanced stuff. And the push your application configuration down here. Briefly mentioning data binding, this is this is definitely targeted for web applications, and data binding is at the UX component level. It binds your component to a database, one or more tables specifically. If you want to connect to other data sources, you can certainly do that with data binding, but for mobile apps and just in general, we encourage people to use the list, which holds all the connection information in itself, over data binding. But that's where you'll find this if that's the route you go. Events is where you'll find your server side and your client side events here for the UX. And then down here in the code section is where you can add custom JavaScript, custom XBasic functions, and define JavaScript actions that are used in your application. So if we go back to controls, those categories we talked about are down here on the bottom. We've got your data, your panel, your containers, other, and defined. Are broken over here. Those same controls are also shown in the add control dialog, which I find to be easier to use when I want to add something than searching through this list down here. Mostly because you can come up here to the filter and type in something like button and see all the types of controls that contain the word button and locate the one you want to add. I'm going to add a text box here, which is a type of data control. And let's also add a button so we can explore events a little bit. So let's collapse that. So what I should have talked through it. What I just did is I've added two controls to this UX component. I've added a text box, which is a data control, which has a get value and a set value API. And then I've also added a button, which has events, but doesn't have a value. I just wanted to briefly talk about events here. So both of these controls have events. They have JavaScript touch mouse pointer events, and then they have JavaScript events. And these two things are actually very different. JavaScript touch mouse pointer events are events that are mobile friendly. The click, the double click, the swipe, these are all actions that can be performed on a touch device. The ones down here, the mouse up, mouse out, key up, focus select, these may or may not be available in your touch environment. For example, mouse over. There's no equivalent of hovering your hand over the screen like you get with a mouse. So these two they've been broken into sections on purpose. You got your touch-friendly events are in one section, and then basically your mouse and keyboard events are in this other. You will see that there are two click events in here and two double-click events. We strongly encourage using the JavaScript touch mouse pointer click event over the on-click event, and that's just because of optimizations we've done based on the environment that you're running in to handle tap or click. And then similarly, if you go over to the button also has events, but some of these events don't apply to the button. For example, a button's value doesn't change, so the onChange button property here doesn't apply. You're going to find that with a few of these, specifically in the JavaScript section. Some of these events won't apply to all the controls, and that's just because what we've listed here are those HTML element events that are actually embedded into the HTML markup that's generated for your application, and these are the names of those events that are added. These ones up here are created using a different method. We call them abstract events, but basically what happens is we watch the control for that event to happen versus embedding the code itself right into the DOM. So it's two different ways of doing things. Knowing that there's a difference between the two might be helpful for some when you think about debugging your application, if you need to figure out something's going wrong. And then I'm going to add a list here as well, so we can take a look at lists, which are a more complex control because they have a builder associated with them. And down here, you're not going to see those events for the list here, but you will find them in the list properties if you open your list up. And down here we have a thing called list events. And if you click this, it shows all of the client-side system events available for the list. And they're broken into two categories. One is the list itself, and the other is events associated with the detail view. So adding a new record, saving a record, loading a record. Those are detail view events. That radio button won't be selectable unless you've enabled a detail view for your list. So let's quickly do that using some sample data. We'll use names and addresses here. Click OK for static data. And go to list properties, and we'll check has detail view. And now if we go look at the list events, here's our detail view events. And these include things like, can I undo a row? Can I make a new record? Places you can hook to add business logic to ensure your application behaves the way it needs to. An example of why you may not want to let somebody create a new record would be if they are currently editing an existing record and haven't saved their changes. So, and there's a lot of different things in here. There's stuff about media files. I mean, I can't possibly explain every single possible event that's in here. But some events to know about, at least for the list, would be the on select, which is the event that gets fired when the list value changes when someone selects a row. This is a good place to hook things like navigating to a new panel to display your detail view, or opening a pop-up window to display your detail view, whatever it is that you want to happen when the user selects that list row. Let's add some things to the layout here and then close it by clicking OK. Let's see here. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about server-side events, and then I'll open it up for questions. One thing I wanted to show people is the Ajax callback workflow that happens when some request goes to the server, triggered through either an action the user has performed, or maybe you've got a automatic timeout thing that runs every 5 minutes to do something. There's a number of events that happen when a callback is made, and it happens on both sides. It happens on the client and it happens on the server. And the very first thing that happens is that there's a check made on the client to determine whether or not the callback can even be made. And that's done in the can Ajax callback event. So this gets called first before anything is sent to the server. Once that check is made, if this event for whatever reason says no, returns false, like callback can't be made, the callback's canceled. On the server side, there is just the well, there's a similar event. There's a can Ajax callback event here as well. This is where you could do something like check if the logged in user has authorization to even make that callback, or you know, some other thing, some other check that you want to do on the server, because code that's on the client, and this is especially true in a web browser, anyone can see that, but they can't see your server-side code. So if, for example, you wanted to check to make sure that the user that's triggered the callback had permission to do the callback, because for some reason they got access to the callback, you could check here to make sure that they are an allowed user in that role before running it. If the callback is allowed to be executed, then the callback is made, and that is usually an XBasic function that you've written yourself. Most callbacks that people interact, or most callbacks that are made by people, are ones that they've written themselves. You've made a callback to generate a report and send out an email, or query a database and send back a list of choices to update a drop-down box. That's going to happen in your XBasic functions, usually where people define them. And then after that completes, it fires another set of functions starting on the server. So the first thing that happens after the callback completes is you get an after Ajax callback event, which you can hook to do additional processing if you wanted to. And then when it gets to the client, there is an after Ajax callback complete event, which you can do even more processing using JavaScript. Now there's a few here that are called on callback failed, on callback not available, and not allowed. And these are special to the Ajax callback action JavaScript itself, and they are cases where the server couldn't be reached, or the user doesn't have permissions, or if the server isn't available. So a callback can fail if it takes too long to run and times out before it sends a response back to your application. It can also fail if it can't even reach the server to begin with. So that's the major difference between these two. Failed means that it got to the server and nothing came back. And then not available means it just wasn't available. So that's what happens just when somebody clicks a button to generate a report that you email or download. All of those events get triggered in order. So that's I'd like to think of a high-level overview of your UX, your intro. We'll talk more about events in an upcoming webinar. Not next week. Deanne will be doing a presentation next week on some best practice tips and how to create your workspaces. So I would like to open it up to questions that anybody may have this time. Now, hopefully you guys aren't too confused.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, we do have a few questions, kind of all over in different places in different directions. So one of the questions, for example, was regarding panels, and there was some question about maybe there was a template that might guide them in this direction, but if you wanted to have two panels side by side on a tablet, but in a desktop only display one panel, for example, for going back and forth, is that, say, already existing in a template, or do you have a good advice for designing that from scratch?
Yeah, so with panels, you can actually give them, and this is something I probably should talk about, consider after, whatever. Let's move this guy up. And I'll put in a panel card around these two and a panel card after it. So panels can have a minimum size, which dictates the smallest size that is required before the panel needs to basically hide itself. And that hiding behavior you get with the panel layout. If there's enough space to display both of the panels, then they'll both appear side by side. And I believe we do have a template that actually demonstrates this. So let's go check real quick. UX filter on panel. All right. So here's an example that shows this mobile app framework 2-panel responsive layout. It demonstrates exactly that. So let's take a look at it. And this explains what this is. So we'll close this. So this is a panel. This is the panel layout. It's got 2 panel cards in it. Panel card 1, I'll double click that to collapse it. And panel card 2. And both of these panels have been configured with a layout size. And this is the minimum size required to display the panel. This one actually has a minimum required of 300. It will grow to fill all the other space if there's more space. This one is constrained. So if we look at this in live preview now, without the mobile preview turned on, we should see 2 panels side by side. So this is that panel that's restricted to 300 pixels, and this is the right-hand panel that requires a 300 pixel width, but it will grow to fill the rest of the space. If you do something like turn on mobile and then live preview this in the mobile app preview, what we're going to see now is just see iPhone 6 here. So this is that case where we only see the right-hand panel, the left-hand panel. The right one's off screen somewhere because there's not enough space to display this and that, because this one needs 300 pixels and the other one requires a minimum of 300 pixels. So you need basically 600 pixels of space to show them side by side. So this has a button in it. When you click it, it displays that panel. And then we have a back button that takes you back. So I believe that answers the question. How would you do that?
Absolutely. Thank you. We had another question here that was on data binding. You mentioned that once or twice in the conversation. And there was some confusion or concern. They were saying they weren't sure or hadn't heard that data binding was for web only and not mobile. Is that true? How does the app know how to interact with the database?
So it's not 100% true. We really discourage using data binding in a mobile application, and the reason why is that data binding doesn't work offline. You have to have an internet connection, and the idea behind being mobile is that you may not have one. So we strongly encourage that if you're going to build a mobile app, that you avoid data binding and stick with your lists, because your lists are going to handle a disconnect for whatever reason. Power goes out, you know, networks get overloaded and shut down. It happens. If you've used data binding, then the user really can't save anything, and all that information that they've entered is not going to be stored to local storage unless you manually put it there. The list control will handle that for you. So that's what I mean when I say web app versus mobile.
Great. I think that's a good explanation of that. Here's another one. This person was having issues with field calculations on a UX. The values are calculated off, are looked up when the UX first loads. The user does not touch the fields generally, other than if a different commission % was applied, other than the default. What happens is the calculations don't occur consistently, and they think that maybe it's because the user is not touching the field. Any thoughts on how to rectify that?
So they have a UX with a calculated field. So a calculated field would be this calculated field expression. And this happens on the client. I assume this is where they're doing their calculation.
Possibly.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure I can tell them how to fix their problem, because I actually would need more information about when things happen. So the calculated field, like let's say this text box is going to display us like a price, or account times price. Yeah, that's okay. And we'll just add those other controls right now. Let's go to text box. I'm going to create multiple controls. I'm going to call this one price, count. Make this one a number. Make this one a number. Make this one a number. Count times price. Now let's just make price a fixed value for now. Make it 5. And then we'll live preview this. So this fires right away. If I change this to 4, it's going to update to 20. If it changes to 16, it's going to update to 80 when I click out of it. So that's the calculated field.
But you're touching it, and that's, I think, maybe some of the issues.
Yeah.
If you're not engaging
If you're
with
not
it,
engaging with it and something changes, it may not update. Um,
could you attach it to an onload event of some sort or something like that?
yeah, I know there's a way you can automatically trigger basically the watch expressions to go and recalculate their values for this. But I think I would need more information just to figure out why their calculations aren't occurring. Because I'm pretty sure if this was set to like 7 and we live preview this, it should automatically add those together in the third text box.
So maybe if that person could send in a follow-up question to
Yeah, we would need
guides
follow
at
up.
Alpha Software, then we would love to get back to you in more depth. Shall we move on to another question then?
Sure.
Okay. Well, this person was wondering sort of about an updated feature in the future, if this maybe is on our roadmap or something to that effect. And they were sort of wondering if there was going to be a feature that would allow a web app to launch another alpha web app using the same security data.
So I think what they're asking about is whether or not we will have single sign-on support, which is like you log in once and then you can access all the things. And it is something the development team is looking at. I cannot give you a time frame because I don't know it, but it is something on our radar.
All right, something to stay tuned about for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes, and lastly, we had a question about the logging component. And could you spend some time maybe explaining how to use the logging component, configuring the logging component, those kinds of things? About time.
I know how you add it. So you can now, when you go in here and you click new web component and then log in, you're going to be asked what type of login component to create. This is like a style thing. You can have an image on the background, image with the prompt on the left or the right. So let's take a look at that one. Login. That's okay. Yeah. So here we go. This is the new login component. It has a whole bunch of stuff in it for configuring in it. And let me see here. I believe we have comments in here that explain what you need to do. Let me read about has integrated. So a lot of the functionality that's in here is actually controlled through properties. So down here you have settings somewhere. I might have scrolled right by it. I did. Here we go. We have this login section. So a lot of those properties or those controls that are in there are linked to this setup here. So two-factor authentication and that kind of thing. Whether or not you've enabled it will dictate whether or not it gets used. In terms of configuring it, I believe most of the work has been done for you. So here we go. There's some text in here that explains what you need to do. And I do apologize. My knowledge of this is still a bit not complete because I've been pulling this thing apart for the last couple weeks and I'm still figuring it out. But what you want to do when you create this is actually come in here and check these static text boxes to see what what you need to do. So some of them are words for the users, some of them are words for you. So I don't know what they mean by explain how to set it up, because you believe you just add it, and then once you've added it, you can use it to log in. I don't have security enabled in this application, which we could certainly create. Let's go over here, web security. Let's use the quick setup genie. I don't know what's gonna happen since I've already made a login, but let's turn everything on. Close that. Let's just not do that. There we go. And this should be everything we need. So let's go take a look at this.
While this is loading, I'll also say that for those of you who are unaware, possibly, Selwyn has created a number of features videos that he releases when he creates or updates major features. And I know there are a number of these feature videos that he's put out about the login component itself. So I added the playlist for the feature videos on our YouTube channel that are now in the chat.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So just the point of interest, you can't test your login in the live preview. So I'm gonna go do a live test here and check it out. So login A5W, I don't have permissions, so I need to configure the permissions here. So let's go web security. I think it's component security. That's allowed. Good. Page security. That's also allowed. Not sure why that wouldn't let me preview it then. We'll have to get back to you on this, and we should probably do a presentation on it later. I'm not entirely sure why that's showing me that message. It shouldn't.
Yeah, it might be a good subject for an upcoming webinar for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Security is a topic we want to talk about. So.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll look into that for sure. Well, we got a couple other questions that did come in while we were discussing those. And one is, could you explain the difference between Action JavaScript and JavaScript? And why don't we throw in JavaScript Actions while we're at it too, just to make it even more confusing.
Yeah, all right.
There are multiple different things to talk about, and they all kind of sound the same.
There are. Yeah, we did good. All right. So when you're adding an event, like say you want to add an event to a button, the click event for the button, so it does something when you click it. There are 3 ways you can add it. You can use it Action JavaScript, which is a whole bunch of little pre-built things we've created that we think lots of people do, like open a UX component. So you want to open a UX component, you want to load it, we'll go select I'll select login here, click OK. So this action, when the button is clicked, will load that UX and display it, in this case in a window. If I had a panel navigator, I might choose a dynamic panel. I might pick a specific panel to show it in, so let's show it in panel card 2 here. And then there's some other stuff you can configure, like what happens if we can't get a hold of the application server to load your UX. And that's just asking me if I want to turn off a property. So to add an action to go and open another screen, open a UX component, I used Action JavaScript to do that. I used a builder. There's no code required in that situation. Click save. Another way you can implement these actions is using JavaScript. So if you click on text mode, you get basically a JavaScript editor, and in here you can do whatever you want. You can insert JavaScript actions, we'll touch on briefly. You can insert UX component methods from the UI library, like we can do like get value here. Excuse me. And then get value gets the value from a control, so like get it from price, and we'll store it in a variable of our price, and then we'll do like alert price. Do something like price is price. So this is using JavaScript. Save that and run it real quick. So when I click this, it displays that the price is 5. If I went up here and changed this to like 9, when I click that, now it says price is 9. So that's implementing the event using JavaScript. Now there are some events that don't have this Action JavaScript builder for adding actions to do things like run a report. So you have to use JavaScript in that case. And in those scenarios, we created JavaScript actions for those scenarios. And JavaScript actions are a way to create basically like an event action thing that runs. Call this one Open UX. We edit it, so now we have that Action JavaScript editor here. So here I can go and open that UX component if I wanted to as an action. There we go. Let's open it in a window. Keep all the defaults. Save it. So this JavaScript action I can now take and I can insert in other places. So we say, click to see the JavaScript code to invoke this action. It's going to show us this pop-up. We can copy the code to clipboard and then go over here to like the button, and in text mode we can open the UX. You can use this Action JavaScript thing here to also insert those actions. But the other cool thing is that you can then go over to your list, and maybe in your list you've got a button in your layout. And in that button event, you've inserted that same action. What are we talking about? It's gone. Did I not save it? I didn't save it. Pardon me. Okay. Save. Okay. All right, it's still there. Okay, so now, I can click that button. I can click on, well, I can't click on the list button because I didn't add it to the list layout. But I can click that button, the click me button, and now it opens that UX component in a pop-up window. But that same code can also be utilized in the list. So let's quickly add our button to the list layout here at the end. And live preview that. So JavaScript actions are just a way to utilize Action JavaScript in places where the Action JavaScript builder isn't necessarily available. So you see both of these buttons do the same thing.
Great.
And
yeah.
I do see this other question that somebody got confused about detail view. What I mean with list control is with or without detail view, the list is gonna work offline.
Right on.
the detail
Great.
view will work offline as well.
Great. And then the other most recent question is about the difference between panel navigator and panel layout.
Ooh, that's a good question. A panel layout, which is this thing you see here, is a bunch of panel cards that are all laid out side by side. Whereas a panel navigator, which we'll insert now, and I'll just move all this stuff inside of it, displays one panel at a time. So if we take a look at this now, let's just move this list down in here into panel card 2 so it's in a place. But we go and take a live preview of this. We'll only see those text controls and the button because our list is now off on another panel in the panel navigator. And with the navigator, there are a bunch of different ways you can navigate your panels. This by default is you can click and drag or swipe to go left and right. But there are a few other layout options in here. Carousel is the swiping one, but you can do a tab layout. You can do one where if the orientation changes, it automatically shows a different panel. You can also do programmatic, which means you use JavaScript or Action Javascript to navigate to another pane. And the really cool thing about all this stuff is you can actually nest them together. So if we move this panel layout inside our panel navigator, then live preview it, we're going to see what we saw before. There are left to right or two panels side by side. So there's our price and there's our list. And then this layout itself can be left to right or top to bottom or right to left or bottom to top if that's the layout you need. So yeah, the layout you can think of as like putting two things side by side or above and below each other. And then the navigator lets you swipe between different panels or navigate between different screens.
Great. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Yeah, I think that's kind of getting to the end of our questions for the day.
Yeah, and I do want to make sure no one's confused about lists and detail views and offline support. It's really in the data binding thing. Did I answer their question?
I think so. Yeah, that person had a follow-up comment, but it was about JavaScript Actions. So they were saying the great thing about JavaScript Actions is if you have to make a change, you only have to do it in one place, not in all the places that you may have entered the same JavaScript code or Action JavaScript.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, it's sort of like a library of your actions, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Your JavaScript that you can save and reuse from place to place.
Definitely.
And it is a little confusing because of the naming convention of Action JavaScript and then JavaScript Actions.
Yeah.
It's a little unfortunate, but the JavaScript Actions, yeah, truly are a useful library of your regularly used actions that you create for yourself. And the Action JavaScript being the little pre-made JavaScript components that they can put in places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do see one more question here. Do you have to data bind the detail view controls? Detail view controls are bound to the list. So if you have a list with a detail view, in here you configure your detail view map. And you can automap these fields, you can create new controls, but all of that binding information, click OK. Like all that information, what that data maps to, that's stored in the list, it's tracked by the list. All right. And if anybody's still confused, please send your questions to guides@alphasoftware.com. And we will be back next week with Dion. And do you remember if Dave's going to be back or no?
I'm not sure if he's back by then or not.
Yeah, I mean, if I was Dave and I went overseas to go on a vacation, I'd probably stay over there. But
Yeah.
all right,
Maybe we'll see his return.
maybe.
Maybe.
All right, thanks for joining me today, guys. Thanks for sticking with us. We will have Dion next week, going over some best practices and some tips and tricks for getting started with app development. And we look forward to seeing you then. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, Sarah.